China's one-child policy was implemented to slow the nation's rapidly growing population, but a law that was supposed to save the country may have doomed it instead. Now China's future is looking grim. The one-child policy led to a rapidly aging population without younger generations to support it, a birth rate that is not sustainable, and infanticide of female babies. The saddest part is if China had done nothing, its population growth would have slowed as it developed. Countless lives could have been saved, and a severe economic collapse would not be on the horizon. Let's take a brief look at what the one-child policy was, why it was created, why it had to end, and how it might have doomed China's future. In 1949, the People's Republic of China was formed from the Republic of China, which was preceded by thousands of years of dynastic rule. It was in the infancy of the PCR that the government started promoting birth control and family planning. It was clear that if the nation was going to modernize and move forward toward industrialization, it would need to get its population growth under control. Resources were required to fuel the economy and build infrastructure, which meant there would be less to go around. When Mao Zedong died in 1976, he was succeeded by Deng Xiaoping. When Xiaoping took over, he found the country's population rapidly approaching 1 billion people. It was decided that a new and much stricter strategy for slowing population growth was needed. In 1978, the government announced a voluntary program that would be put in place encouraging Chinese families to have 2 or fewer children. It was framed as reducing the population growth being good for China, and every citizen should do their part. But the following year, the decision was made to lower the number of children a family could have to only 1. This one-child policy applied to mostly urban areas and certain provinces in China. It was these areas that the population was growing the fastest, and it was much easier for the government to keep an eye on the citizens living in cities than it was to enforce this new one-child policy on the more rural areas of the country. On September 25, 1980, the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party published an official bulletin to all party members that the new population control measures should be implemented throughout the nation. This would become the official start date of the one-child policy in China. It's important to note that during the time between the discussion of slowing population growth and the official enactment of the one-child policy, things had changed a lot. Medicine and technology were much more advanced, which meant fewer child-age deaths and that older people were living longer. The catalyst for the perfect storm of demographic problems had its foundation long before the government began restricting the number of children people could have. For centuries, it made sense to have large families so that there were many hands to help work in the fields and carry out manual labor. But this was not the future of China, or at least not the future the government wanted in China. Industrialization made having large families not only less desirable, but obsolete now that machines could do much of the work. If the Chinese government had paused for a moment to think about the ramifications of intervening in the natural family practices that occur during the modernization of a country, they would have realized they were about to make a huge mistake. But this is something we'll come back to later on. The one-child policy is pretty self-explanatory. Basically, the vast majority of Chinese families can now only have 1 child per couple. If they had more, there would be consequences. However, there were several exceptions to the rule. Some minority groups, farmers, fishermen, and people with disabilities were allowed to have more than 1 child to help with the labor-intensive aspects of their lives. Like so many laws in an authoritarian regime, people in power could also be exempt from the policy due to their status. However, the one-child policy applied to pretty much everyone else and was seen as the solution to China's biggest problem. Now things are going to get uncomfortable. If a couple had a second child and did not fall into one of the various exemption categories, they were heavily fined or had to suffer much more severe punishments. The couples could be harassed by the community, lose their jobs, or may have even had their extra child or children taken from them. But things would soon turn even grimmer for violators of the law. After the one-child policy began, there were some initial consequences that arose. To be fair, it did cause birth rates to decline and population growth to slow, but this did not happen in a sustainable or organic way. With each year that passed, the sex ratio between males and females became more skewed. Remember from biology class that a population left to its own devices will have a sex ratio at birth of approximately 50% boys and 50% girls because that's how genetics works. Well, China was messing with the natural order of things by pressuring couples to only have 1 child. And since there was one sex that was more desirable than the other for certain reasons we'll discuss in a bit, you can probably guess what happened next. Now, to be fair, humans are peculiar in the sense that our sex ratio at birth tends to be 51% boys to 49% girls. Scientists believe this happens more because female fetuses die during pregnancy due to a variety of factors. This results in slightly more males being born than females in a given human population. Regardless, what is important is the ratio should be relatively close to 50-50. Instead, during the one-child policy, the Chinese population saw around a 3 to 4% increase in male births compared to female births. This would have drastic consequences down the road, but what it meant initially was both shocking and appalling. Chinese families preferred to have a male baby because sons inherited the family name, which continues the lineage. Males are also traditionally responsible for the care of their elderly parents. This meant that many families given a choice would rather have a male child than a female child, which probably gives you an idea of what was to come. By examining the ratio of males to females who are alive today and born during the one-child policy era in China, we know there are around 120 males to every 100 females. Looking at the larger picture, this means that there are approximately 30 million more males than females in the country. However, this is a nice way of putting it. To put it bluntly, the ratio of males to females has been skewed due to the government's population control policy, which means that researchers estimated around 30 million female babies were either aborted, killed, or taken out of the country as a result of the one-child policy. There were also instances where families had multiple children, but since any babies born after the first child needed to be hidden from the government and unreported, it led to millions of undocumented individuals who would face many hardships later in life. They would not be able to go to school or find employment. Their options for any type of future became very limited. It's estimated that this happened to hundreds of thousands or even millions of people in China. And the ironic part is that now China desperately needs every one of its citizens to work and have offspring, even if they were undocumented in the past. An interesting and less tragic result of the one-child policy was that tens of thousands of Chinese girls were adopted by families around the world during this time. As word of the atrocities occurring in China reached other countries, nonprofits and adoption organizations sprung into action to try to save the lives of as many young girls as possible. This was good news for any female who was adopted by a kind family and able to get out of the country. But not everyone had a happy ending. The removal of young girls from China also led to an even wider gap between the number of males and females in China, since those who were adopted likely did not and will not return to China to get married and live out the rest of their lives for obvious reasons. And this also brings up another ramification of what happened as a result of the one-child policy. Now, around 1/4 of the male population in China will never get married because there just aren't enough women. We're not saying everyone needs to get married or that everyone wants to get married, but we are saying that approximately 17% of the male population doesn't even have the option. It's not clear what the social ramifications of this disparity will be, if any, but some experts suggest it could lead to social unrest in the future. So, the one-child policy caused a huge amount of problems from the get-go and would result in several much bigger problems in the future. However, it did succeed in reducing birth rates and slowing population growth, which was the goal. But eventually, the Chinese government decided to do away with the policy altogether. This was more out of necessity than because they were willing to admit the glaringly obvious flaws in their plans. In 1970, the population growth rate of China was 2.5%. By the year 2000, it had decreased to 0.7%. Unfortunately for China, the one-child policy continued for 16 more years after that, which resulted in long-lasting problems that might lead to economic collapse. Most experts agree that if the one-child policy had ended much sooner, its future consequences could be managed. But that's not what happened. Instead, China continued its aggressive stance on population control for far too long, and birth rates plummeted well below sustainable levels. In 2013, China decided that all couples could now have 2 children if either parent was from a single-child household. The reason for doing this was that birth rates had declined by too much, and the government needed to slowly ramp up population growth if they were going to have a large enough workforce to continuously fuel their economy. It seemed to work as birth rates went up the following year, but not by nearly as much as expected. In 2015, only 1.45 million couples out of the 11 million eligible decided to have a second baby. It became glaringly obvious that China had overshot the acceptable level of population control. They were now in big trouble as the nation's population was growing older and there were not enough babies being born to support the aging generations in the years to come. China had reached the point of no return, and a monstrous demographic problem reared its ugly head. This demographic problem is the direct result of decades of one-child policy and is the biggest threat to the stability of the country that they've ever faced. It's important to know that, left to its own devices, the population of China would have eventually declined anyway. Yes, their population growth was likely unsustainable due to limited available resources in the country and conflicting views on how to use those resources, but we've seen that as nations industrialize and become more developed, birth rates go down for a variety of reasons. Most of these reasons have to do with education, work-life balance, and the cost of living. In fact, pretty much every developed country on the planet is experiencing or will experience a population decline in the near future due to this very phenomenon. So, if China had just left things alone, its population growth problem would have eventually fixed itself in a more manageable way. Economists and demographic researchers both in China and globally warned the government of the consequences of their one-child policy, yet, like with so many important decisions, the government did not listen to the experts. In 2021, the Chinese leadership announced married couples can now have as many kids as they wanted. The government also promised to fund more programs such as childcare, job security initiatives for expecting parents, and financial assistance to couples who wish to grow their families. This was the official end to any type of government mandate regarding the number of children a family could have. The Chinese government knew this needed to be done, as academics and researchers continuously sounded the alarm for years that the future was looking very grim if China's birth rates didn't begin to increase. As of the last few years, China's population has still been growing, but this is due to a combination of births and people living longer, so these numbers are a bit deceiving. Most experts predicted that the Chinese population would peak sometime between 2020 and 2030 and then go into decline. The Chinese Health Department said in 2021 that it expected the population decline to occur within the next 3 years. Best estimates from sources worldwide put China's population declining as soon as this year or at least by 2025. China's current birth rate is around 1.7 children per couple, which is significantly lower than the 2.5 children per couple needed to maintain a stable population. This is bad news, because as we're about to explain, China no longer needs to slow its population growth. They need to ramp it up. What it comes down to is that China needed to end its one-child policy long ago. Currently, there just aren't enough young people to sustain the economic growth of the country and support the growing retired and elderly population. China defines its working-age population as anyone between 16 and 59. This demographic has continuously been declining in number since 2012. The United Nations predicts that China could have 61 million fewer workers by 2030, which will not be sustainable if China hopes to continue to grow its economy and spread its influence around the world. China currently has a 5-to-1 worker-to-retiree ratio. This is somewhat sustainable, but if the birth rate continues to decline, or if China manages to somehow keep it relatively constant, it'll still mean that by around 2040, the worker-to-retiree ratio will be closer to 1.6 to 1. This is absolutely not sustainable, as there just won't be enough workers paying taxes to sustain social programs for the retired population. On top of that, the economy will go into decline, as the demographics who are working and spending money to fuel the economy will be significantly lower than it is right now. The elderly population of China is also becoming greatly concerned with the ability of their children and grandchildren to support them like in the past. When parents had several children to look after them, it spread out the responsibility and financial burden. This made taking care of the parents and grandparents easier on everyone. However, for decades, families have only been having one child, which does not create the same kind of familial support network as in the past. It's expected that the public spending on healthcare will need to be doubled before 2050, as the aging population will require more doctors, hospitals, and medicine. This means that the government will have no choice but to divert resources from other sectors if they want to take care of their elderly citizens. Basically, the culmination of all the problems that the one-child policy caused has left China with a disaster that could cripple the nation. This is why the policy needed to be ended long ago. So now that couples are allowed to have as many children as they want, China's problems are over, and the nation's on its way to recovery, right? Wrong. The demographic problem is like a snowball rolling downhill. It's already been set in motion, and as it keeps rolling, it's getting bigger and bigger. At some point, it'll crash and cause a big mess. Then, and only then, can China start rebuilding their metaphorical snow castle. The change in policy in 2013 to allow Chinese couples to have 2 children did not help raise birth rates. The removal of all restrictions on how many children a couple can have will likely not change anything either. When looking at if ending the one-child policy and any subsequent policies will fix the demographic problem China is facing, the answer is no. In 2021, there were approximately 10 million babies born in China. This is the lowest number of births since 1949. The dialing back of restrictions has not had any measurable impact on birth rates and likely won't in the future. This is because the attitudes and desires of the Chinese people have changed as the nation has grown. People are waiting longer to start a family as they're more career-focused. More and more Chinese women are pursuing degrees in higher education and securing jobs of their own. This is very common in developing and developed nations. When women have more opportunities and education, they tend to have fewer children, both by choice and for economic reasons. But it's not just having kids that the Chinese people are waiting longer to do. The average age that people are getting married is increasing as well. In 2010, on average, women were 24 and men were 26 when they got married. In 2020, the ages for both sexes were around 29 years old. So it's clear that people are putting off family life longer, which is definitely not going to help China's population problem. The crazy part is that the Chinese government has only itself to blame. And even if someone did want to have multiple kids, there is so much time, planning, and money that needs to be spent to raise a child that it acts as a deterrent. So the high cost of children plus women planning to have only one or maybe two babies at a later age is a recipe for disaster when it comes to stabilizing the population of China. The one-child policy was brutal and worked too well. Now China is paying for it with an increasingly older population and not enough young people willing to increase birth rates. On top of this, there just won't be enough people to support the growing Chinese economy in the future due to the skewed demographics, which are also the result of the former one-child policy. So what, if anything, can China do to save the country from economic collapse? If China's looking for immediate results, they're out of luck. Providing financial and social support for families to have more than one child is a good idea but a slow one. Even if birth rates skyrocketed right now, those babies won't be able to contribute to the economy and social welfare system for another 18 or so years. By that point, China would be in so much trouble that all the young people entering the workforce wouldn't make much of a difference. And since it's clear Chinese couples are in no rush to have larger families, this would not be a viable option. Many experts say that improving the average productivity of workers, the efficiency of markets, and allowing immigrants into the country to contribute to the economy might be able to help save China from the economic collapse when the large population of older workers retires. It has also been suggested that China could raise the retirement age so that those older workers contribute to the economy for longer. But this would likely just be a band-aid that wouldn't really solve the problem. It'll likely come down to improving worker productivity and education along with removing some of the unnecessary red tape that the state uses to maintain control of everything going on in the country. Immigration might also be one of the only options China has if it's serious about continuing to grow its workforce. There is little chance that the Chinese people will be able to increase population growth on their own after decades of the one-child policy. There is no easy answer for China. At this point, the coming demographic crisis is inevitable. Will the nation be able to weather the storm? Probably. Will it lead to pain and suffering as the authoritarian government tries to grow its economy and power while the population growth is on the decline? Absolutely. Older generations will likely suffer as younger generations are overworked. In an extremely dystopian future, China could force their citizens to have more children just like they forced them to have fewer children in the past. But that doesn't seem like a very likely scenario. Now watch why China will never be a global superpower. Or check out China's mysterious islands will keep you up at night.